Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode of Shariah Intelligence. I am your host Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topic are two of our distinguished facilitators for this course, volunteers with the Da'wah Institute, Sister Salatu Saleh and Brother Nasir Bello. You're both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Today we'll be looking at the last episode that relates to the subject of the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic Legal Maxims segment of this course. And we will be looking today at how scholars categorize evidence into groups. So we will find on the spectrum of certainty, on one end of the spectrum, what scholars are fully agreed on, what is qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala. In other words, all the certainty is there. And on the other end of the spectrum, where there is greater presumption and a greater degree of doubt or speculativeness because of the ijtihad involved. Inshallah, we will start with an overview of this from Brother Nasir. How do scholars, or how would we understand the various categories of evidence on the spectrum of certainty based on their authenticity or the integrity of the source of the evidence, and also the level of clarity or certainty regarding the meaning and the implication?
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In trying to categorize evidence, scholars usually, as we discussed in the past, look at two variables. They look at the factors that are called dilala and subut, where you talk about the authenticity of the evidence itself, and then you talk about the meaning and implication of the evidence. That is when discussing the dilala. At the end of the day, after looking at the evidence, what are you coming up with? Is it really conclusive, or it is inconclusive because of the clarity of the evidence? Now, the permutation that scholars were able to come up with in trying to analyze or categorize evidence are four. The first permutation is that where you have what they call qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, that in terms of the authenticity of the text, you are certain, it is explicit, it is clear that it is authentic, you are certain about that. And now when you come to the dilala also, it is equally explicit, it is clear, you are certain about the definitive meaning of that particular text. And the example of that is the Quran, that is really clear and explicit when it comes to meaning verses of the Quran. And then also what we call hadith mutawatir, that we equally discussed, that are explicit too. So when you have verse of the Quran or hadith mutawatir that are explicit in meaning, then you say this is an evidence that is coming from the category of qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. Now the second category, or the second permutation, is that which has the evidence established to be authentic and certain in terms of authenticity. That is what we call qat'i thubut. But the meaning, that is the dilala, is speculative or presumptive, and that is what we call dhanni dilala. So the second permutation is a situation where you have qat'i thubut, dhanni dilala. And the example of such also are verses of the Quran or hadith mutawatir that has a very presumptive meaning, that is open to a variety of meaning, and you have scholars differing when it comes to interpretation or the meaning and implication they associate with this particular evidence. The third category, or the third permutation that you would find, is that where the thubut is qat'i, the subut is actually the subut is dhanni, meaning the authenticity is actually not certain. You are not certain, you are presumptive regarding the authenticity of the evidence. But then the implication or the meaning is certain and clear. That is dhanni thubut qat'i dilala. This is an example of say ahad hadith, where you have some level of presumption when it comes to the authenticity of the evidence, or maybe some of the other secondary sources that scholars usually use in trying to do ijtihad. But when you look at the implication or the meaning is explicit, is clear, it's not presumptive. So this is the third category or the third permutation where you have dhanni thubut qat'i dilala. And the last category is that where you find the thubut is speculative, is presumptive, and also the dilala, that is the meaning that is associated with that, is also presumptive and speculative. That is what they call dhanni thubut, dhanni dilala. And therefore this sums up the four categories or the four permutations that scholars usually use in trying to categorize or classify evidence.
This is interesting. So one could look at all Sharia rulings and fatwas of scholars in as being in a house with 4 rooms. And in one room you have what everybody agrees with, the kind of rulings that are based on qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. They are certain about the source and authenticity, like Quran and Hadith mutawatir, and the meaning is explicitly clear and definitive. In another room you have things coming from Quran and Hadith mutawatir, so they are qat'i thubut, but the dhanni is dilala. Sorry, the dilala is dhanni. The implication is presumptive and there's disagreement there. The fourth room you will have a group of rulings where the source of the ruling would be presumptive. The thubut, the evidence or the wurud is presumptive, but the implication is explicitly clear. So this may be from any of the secondary sources or from an ahad hadith, as you've mentioned, where there's agreement, however, on what it's saying, but the source is where there's the disagreement. And the last room where you've got this collection of mostly ijtihad rulings coming from presumptive sources, and the conclusions also things that scholars would differ on. Sister Salah, what more could you add to this discussion on the implications of these classifications and why it's important to look at these?
To pick up from where you talked about the rulings or fatwas all being like they're in the same house but they're categorized differently. As we will see further on in this discussion, there are many examples of each of these categories, and many of these examples are also commonly known, both from fatwas from before early scholars and even contemporary rulings. The thing to highlight here, and which we'll keep emphasizing, is once you have a permutation that has a dhanni element, once a ruling or a matter belongs to it, it just follows naturally that ijtihad becomes necessary, and in some cases ijtihad has to be done, because you cannot come to a conclusion on the meaning of or interpretation of a particular ayah or hadith, or perhaps because the hadith itself, from its source, there is some level of presumption about the authenticity of that source. It follows that you then have to engage at a much deeper level and tap into some of the other sources of evidence to see where exactly should this ruling be placed and how should it be treated and what strength should that particular source of evidence be given. While doing this, of course, the scholars might realize that this evidence belongs in the permutation or the area where you would say the authenticity is presumptive, it's not conclusive, so it's dhanni thubut or dhanni wurud, and the meaning itself is also presumptive, it's not unambiguous, so it's dhanni dilala. Once you have this, any piece of evidence belonging to this permutation, that is, I'll call it a double Z on both areas, it just follows therefore that there is greater room for ijtihad, there is greater flexibility, because the presumptuous nature is higher, and therefore this is an area where people should be more tolerant, more respectful of different opinions and of diversity. Knowing the category to which a particular piece of evidence belongs, knowing what permutation it belongs, helps us to know how to treat it, how to approach it. It also guides us in our discussions and in our debates, because where, let's say, it belongs to that permutation of dhanni thubut, dhanni dilala, or the authenticity itself is presumptive, even if the meaning is clear, it just follows that then this is not something that we should be over attached to, that should generate much heat, because knowing these categories even helps us with greater self-regulation about how much attentional energy or emotion should you invest in an issue. It also helps you highlight for yourself and for others where a person might be making a big fuss over an issue based on personal bias or cultural bias, or just based on, well, this is how I've always known it, this is what I've been taught, I have never heard this before. Because once you say, but the authenticity is presumptive in nature, or the meaning is not clear, so why are you acting as if this is something that is qat'i thubut, like a verse of the Quran, with a clear meaning and implication, qat'i dilala? One more thing is this whole concept of triangulation, which we've brought up again and again before, that even as we might say a piece of evidence as a bonding element, there's a presumptive element, even with regards to the meaning and the implication, or with regard to the authenticity. When we triangulate, meaning we look at other sources of evidence, we look at the maqasid, we look at the maxims, we look at other pieces of secondary evidence. When we are able to do those things, even if the piece of evidence would never be elevated to the level of qat'i dilala or qat'i thubut, at least we reduce the degree of presumptiveness, we then increase the degree of certainty. Because when we say something is dhanni, even within the dhanni room, let me use the metaphor you used before, it's possible to have the corner where anything in that far corner is very, very dhanni, very, very ambiguous, but you might say something closer to the door of the room is less so. So we can increase certainty and reduce the uncertainty based on this triangulation using other sources.
Thank you very much. So if we pick from there, the points you've mentioned, it is useful for an individual to know what to take really seriously, what to make sure you've learnt, that those fundamentals of the deen are the most important things to learn about Islam. And once people have accepted that they are Muslims, and if the argument, however, belongs to another room, so, it belongs to a room where there's dhanni or there's increasing level of presumption and speculation, we should naturally expect there will be differing opinions. In fact, the moment you ask somebody, why do you hold that opinion? The kind of evidence they give you can let you know which room, which category this argument or the evidence for that argument belongs to. And okay, it seems he is presenting or she is presenting a point in room 1 that I wasn't aware of. I better search for greater certainty. I better know this properly. If it is an area where it belongs to a category where there's dhanni, then you should expect that if you hear something you've never heard before, fine, you'll always keep learning of new opinions, and the need not to treat dhanni as if it was qat'i, to not give greater certainty than is due to a particular argument. On that, could you start taking us through the first category? Qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. So on this spectrum, the side with the greatest certainty. What are the qualities of that room? What fits into that room? What are some examples of rulings that belong to that permutation of authenticity and an implication and meaning?
Okay. When we look at evidence and we say which evidence belongs to the qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala category, or let's say room, and again, let's use the example of the house. Let's call that room 1. Room 1 has qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, meaning the authenticity is certain, it's definitive, and the meaning and implication is also categorical, it's unambiguous. So this is what you might call absolute certainty. Evidence that would belong to that category would be evidence coming from the Quran or Hadith Mutawatir, both of which belong to the qat'i thubut category, meaning both of them their authenticity is certain, it's definitive. The Quran itself and Hadith Mutawatir are based on so many sources of evidence that connects them to the source to which they are attributed. In the case of the Quran, it's Allah, and in the case of Hadith Mutawatir, it's the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That tracing puts them in the place where there can be no reasonable doubt or no shadow of doubt about the connection between this book or these narrations and their attributed sources. That's on one level. That is what makes them qat'i thubut, definitive with regard to authenticity. Now on the other level is the meaning and the implication. The meaning and the implication would be qat'i dilala because or when the meaning of the words themselves, the implication is clear. Clear meaning there is no need for ijtihad. There is no need for presumption. The words do not lend themselves to multiple variations of meaning that do not naturally work together, because that is when scholars will start to differ. Does it mean this or does it mean that? In the case of any verse of the Quran or any hadith that is said to be qat'i dilala, what that means is that the scholars have looked at this and they say, look, any reading of this would give you this meaning or these interpretations. There's no other interpretation, or there are no other interpretations that will lend themselves to this. You don't need to go into ijtihad. Now, when you look at such verses of the Quran or such hadith, they are the kind which actually establish what we call ma'lum min ad-din bidorura, meaning those fundamental essentials of the religion that people should know or understand. Things to do with salah, with zakah, hajj, the pillars of Islam, the articles of faith. And we find that whatever the school of Islamic jurisprudence might be, they don't have diversity on those things. They do not. When we talked about the equations of the tools that they use for usul fiqh, we said when it comes to Quran and Hadith Mutawatir, all the schools treat those two as the first sources, the first things they would look at. And once they find from the Quran and Hadith Mutawatir that the meaning or implication is clear, then there's no ijtihad, they don't go beyond that. So the schools are in agreement on that. What's also more interesting, I think, is to even look at what we call the sects within Islam. When one hears sects, one thinks of a religion that has split maybe all the way to the roots. But when you look at the sect in Islam, you'll find that when it comes to these fundamentals, salah, zakat, hajj, the belief in prophets, there is unity amongst them. That's why a well-known sect such as the Shias, if they were to just discuss the question of do Muslims perform salat, do we accept that salah is something we should do, you would not differentiate between them and anybody from any other sect. And they would still go on hajj. And nobody would see them in hajj and say, what are you doing here? And they wouldn't say, oh no, we are not going. So on those issues that are qat'i dilala, you don't see diversity among scholars, among the schools, or among even different sects and groups. Another thing I think that needs to be mentioned about sources of evidence that are qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala, that is definitive in their authenticity and meaning, is that they provide knowledge of the divine, ilm al-yaqin, that certainty of knowledge of the divine. So we cannot say categorically Allah said unless what we are saying comes from the Quran, Hadith Mutawatir, and the meaning and implication of what we are claiming he said is clear. It's not ambiguous. These are important things, I think, for all of us to understand, because early on when I mentioned we need to be mindful of where we are putting our attention, investing our energy, it's in matters to do with rule one. That is where we ought to pay more attention. And in as much as I wouldn't say, oh, get emotional and quarrel, but that is where you say, yes, this is what establishes Islam. This is what makes one a Muslim, the minimum requirement. It comes from this room one. And if someone categorically rejects something coming from room one, rejects a verse of the Quran, rejects the meaning or implication, rejects something that is in Hadith Mutawatir, which with clear meaning and interpretation, only then can we say that such rejection, I would not say would, could take someone out of the fold of Islam. Because the actual declaration that says this person is no longer a Muslim should come from a competent scholar. And I need to underline competent scholar, not two Muslim Student Society members arguing in the mosque, not two brothers sitting in their sitting room and having a discussion, not people in a hall listening to a lecture and then taking sides. No, it's a competent scholar, because it requires a deep knowledge of the deen, a deep knowledge of these rooms, a deep knowledge of the implication of a source of evidence put together with this, the ability to reach out and triangulate before you can say categorically that this person, by saying or doing this, has effectively taken him or herself out of the fold of Islam. And that is a dangerous route to thread, because submission to Allah is primarily between the one submitting and Allah himself. So it is Allah who is the one to say, I accept this, I reject that. Not for us to ascribe to him acceptance or rejection, except we are quoting from a source of evidence that is qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala. And as I said again, it's not two people sitting and arguing in their room. You're not a kafir. That one is a kafir. No. It's a sensitive issue and should not be taken lightly.
I think just to underscore that sensitivity and the need for tremendous humility on this subject area, it brings to mind the number of positions that growing up, and I think it applies to each one of us, but definitely to me, where I was 100% certain that this is, what the Quran says on this, and there is no other way of understanding it. And somebody says something new that I've never heard of before, and you start questioning the person's Islam. And you start treating what you are certain about as if that was actually how scholars view things. Whereas as you grow, as you read more, you start to find, on this topic where I honestly believe there was just one opinion and that was the truth, then you realize, Ibn Qayyim says there are 9 differing opinions on this, and you start asking, where have I been? So the need to really be very cautious. Just because you've never heard of a difference of opinion doesn't mean it is qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. So the need for it to really be scholars of substance who end up deciding, are you in or out of the faith? Brother Nasir,
if I may also
please.
I know we usually would say the verses that establish Salah are qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. I think also necessary to mention, I know it will come up probably later, that even so, it's not every issue about Salah that you will get evidence as qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, just to mention, so that one doesn't hear us saying this and say, you see, once it's Salah, everything I have been taught is absolutely correct, anything different is wrong. I think what we're emphasizing is the existence of such a practice as Salah is based on qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala evidence.
So issues like where you put your hand in salat and whether you shake your finger or whether you consider this as compulsory or not, maybe dhanni thubut or dhanni dilala, while 5 daily prayers or 4 rakahs here or 3 there would be dhanni. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Would be qati. Thank you. Mala Nasir, what more can you say on this and more examples?
I like it actually that you've already come up with a metaphor of rooms, and I think Sister Salatu has done a very good job in trying to explain to us what we should expect in this particular room that we're already in, that room which is specifically dealing with evidence that are qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. Now what I want to do is to sort of show to us what are the things that are obtainable that we can find in this kind of room. And these are things like ma'lum min ad-dini bil-darura, these things like your fundamentals of the deen, the 5 pillars of Islam, where you find many verses of the Quran explicitly talking about these 5 pillars of Islam, the pillars of kalimatu shahada, that believe, the salah, the zakah, and the fasting, as they were captured clearly by the hadith of Jibril, which is very, very popular and clear. Akbirni anil Islam, he said Islam is about believing in Allah and prayer and fasting and zakah and hajj. So these are what we call the 5 pillars of Islam that are all unanimously agreed upon, and the meaning and the implication of what actually they are about is very clear. Now, if you still look at that particular hadith, you will also see the discussion around the 6 articles of faith, where also you find many verses of the Quran that are equally talking about this issue of 6 articles of faith. Believe in Allah, believe in angels, believe in the book, أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر وتؤمن بالقدر خيره وشره. Believe in Allah, believe in the messengers of Allah, believe in the book, believe in angels, believe in destiny, good or bad. So these are things that are already clear, and they are coming from a mutawatir sources. So other examples are things around the development and realization of some important virtues like justice. You find in many places Allah talking about Him being just and hating any thought or any form of injustice. And He said, "Inni harramtu zulma ala nafsi," for example, وَجَعَلْتُهُ بَيْنَكُمْ مُحَرَّمًا فَلَا تَظَالَمُوا. Injustice, I have made it forbidden upon myself and also onto you people. And therefore, in any form, in any shape, in any dimension, you shouldn't perpetrate injustice. You should be just, you should be fair. Virtues of compassion, for example. The entire religion is about compassion. Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam will say, "Ad-dinu yusrun." In fact, if you try to make things harder for people, you find Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam being angry with situations where some people made an attempt to make things very difficult and hard for people. So this idea of compassion, lots of examples, lot of evidences that are actually trying to promote and establish this virtue of compassion. Look at the hadith of Mu'az, for example. Even in terms of salah, when somebody complained that he is reciting very long, verses, chapters of the Quran while in prayer, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not happy about that, and he reprimanded Mu'az. He said, "Afatanun anta ya Mu'az." And he even cite example that you should be merciful, you should be compassionate when it comes to prayer. You should be compassionate about people. The entire idea of Islam is about being compassionate with people. لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ. Allah has actually sent to you a messenger. حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. This idea of compassion, it's everywhere if you look at it. And another example of what you would find in that particular room is these issues of prohibition that are agreed upon. The issues of, for example, the prohibition of zina. لا تقربوا الزنا إنه كان فاحشة وساء سبيلا. The issue of drinking alcohol, the Quran will tell you, إنما الخمر والميسر والأنصاب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان فاجتنبوه. The final verse, if you look at the verses of alcohol and where the Quran was explicit about prohibition. If you look at the issues of suicide, for example, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا. لَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ. You shouldn't take yourself to something that will harm you, something that will at the end of the day waste your life. So this area of prohibition that is agreed upon by by all scholars. Now there is also this area of stipulation of inheritance to different categories of heirs. يوصيكم الله في أولادكم للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين فإن كن نساء. This very long verse which try to apportion what is due for different categories of heirs on the issues of inheritance. And another very good example is this issue of the need for somebody to prove, to provide for evidence when it comes to proving the sin or an act of zina, and the punishment that is associated with such kind of accusation when you are not able to prove. Look at what the Quran said: whoever accuse somebody of zina and could not provide that he cannot be able to bring this 4 witnesses it says فَجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدًا. So this idea of stipulating 4 witnesses is clear. No any interpretation will say, this is 4, if you can bring 2 is okay. It has to be 4. And the punishment for not being able to provide that particular, that the punishment for qazaf, essentially, for slander against somebody, it says you should lash them 80 lashes. So these are things that are clear. In this room, everything is clear. There is no anything that, it's not, there is a light in the room. So you can just see, everything is visible, everything is clear. So that is how room 1 is, which is actually talking about explicit, nothing presumptive, nothing speculative. So if they say this is black, that is what you are going to see. It cannot appear gray. Somebody will say, no, what I can see is brown, and you are saying gray. Everything is clear in that particular room. Allahu Alam.
I like the metaphor of the light added to the room. So not just do we have, a solid room with things no Muslim disagrees about. And those Muslims that actually have a disagreement in that room, as of course assuming it's not about ignorance or ta'wil, the things in this room are what Muslims believe. And it is easier for scholars to say, if you don't accept what is in this room, then you are not a Muslim. You're not another sect. You are not a Muslim. The issue also about it being very illuminated. There's no shadows in this room. There's light from every direction. We are certain about what we are looking at. And of course, as has already been mentioned earlier, yes, a particular ruling is explicitly clear, but that doesn't mean that there's no rukhsa for the purpose who is in haja or person in haja or darura. But regarding what does the Quran and Sunnah say, what's the normal position, it's very clear in this room, and it applies to Aqidah, it applies to behavior, it applies to acts of worship and rituals, ibadat, it applies to all these areas. Could you take us now into room 2? Room 2, the category of qat'i thubut. So we are certain regarding the authenticity, but dhanni dilala. There is a level of presumption regarding the meaning or the implication. In other words, once you look at all the evidence, you say it's not conclusive. Unlike in room 1, once you look at the verse and all relevant evidence, you conclude, there's only one conclusion, one meaning. So looking at room 2, could you tell us more about room 2? And let's have some examples of what we would find in this second room.
Okay. In room 2, the interesting thing about room 2 is, okay, there is light. You can see everything that is there. So the issue is not about whether it is there or it's not. There is agreement regarding the fact that these things that are seen are there. But then what do they mean? That is where you'd find people different.
When you dig into it or look into the
exactly,
look into the
exactly.
pot.
That is where you see this guy saying, this is this, and the other, this is A. The other guy will say, no. It can't be A, it is B. So that is the issue with room 2, as against room 1, where everything is clear, and therefore in room 1, if somebody says, I can see this, and it is A, everybody say, yeah, this is A. But if you come to room 2, where the availability, the thing is really established to be there, it's certain in room 2. And that is what speaks to the idea of qat'i thubut, that it is there in the room. Everybody can see it. What it means, what that is where you'll have differences of opinion. And this is a domain of, you have the Quran or Sunnah Mutawatir having different, meanings and interpretation, where you see scholars differing regarding the interpretation or what they are able to make sense of the meaning of this particular evidence. Because of this cloudy nature of this particular evidence, scholars have agreed that it is not useful, or it does not qualify to the domain of what we call ma'lum min ad-dini bil-darura. It does not meet up with the minimum effective dose that we talked about earlier. And another important thing is, it is the domain of interpretation. That is where you find issues like this case of Hiraba, for example. إن الذين يحاربون الله ورسوله, and the end of the verse where Allah talked about the kind of punishment that should be given to this kind of people that did corruption, وَيَسْعَوْنَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا, أَنْ يُقَتَّلُوا, that those who do irhab to Allah and His Messenger and perpetrate acts of corruption, even on that you would find them differing on what actually is the scope of interpretation that you would that is obtainable there. Some will restrict it to the issue of banditry, kidnapping, and killings. Others will go beyond that and look at even siphoning public treasury, for example, and other forms of corruption that are obtainable. Treason and
terrorism.
All that. Exactly, and terrorism. But again, if you go further, when stipulations is made in the verse regarding the kind of, the variety of punishment that should be attributed or should be prescribed for this kind of offense or crime, it says أن يقتلوا أو يصلبوا أو تقطع أيديهم من خلاف أو ينفوا من الأرض, that they should be killed or their hands should be cut in alternation with their legs, أو ينفوا من الأرض,
or crucified,
or crucified. Now the important thing or the most interesting word in this particular verse is this أو ينفوا من الأرض, where if you look at the classical books, they mostly talk about exile, sending them away from the city or the society. But then some contemporary scholars are looking at the idea of imprisonment. Imprisonment, or you cage him, and now he is not part of the society as a way of punishment, as another lens within which we look at the interpretation of this particular.
Probably more relevant to today, because exile, you'll just problem.
Well, of course, in the era of internet, sending exiling somebody does not necessarily actually help in addressing the illah that he is able to, that you are trying to address.
For some, it's not a punishment.
Exactly, it's not even a punishment. Now, another good example that you'd find is, still we've been bringing up this issue, the issue of quru, regarding this issue of waiting period for a divorced woman before she decide to think about or become open for other suitors, where the Quran talks about this 3 quru, and you find scholars differing on the meaning of this particular concept of quru. والمطلقات يتربصن بأنفسهن 3 قروء. That is the waiting period. The Malikis will say the quru is associated with the period itself, the bleeding itself. And other scholars will look at the period in between the bleeding. It's what they call quru. And the implication of that is the outcome at the end of the day. If it is the bleeding, probably it may not necessarily be 3 months as against the period in between the bleeding. So these are issues around interpretation, and that is what is actually obtainable in that particular room that we are now in, where there is debate and discussion around understanding the meaning of the things that are obtainable or available in the room. Another example or another thing you find is this verse that talks about wudu. That if you are performing wudu, it said wamsahu bi ru'usikum. You rub your head, for example, and in fact even the issue of arjulakum or arjulikum, that scholars you would find different. Now if you say, okay, rub your head, how? You would find a lot of views among scholars. Some will say, okay, you can just put water in your head. Some will talk about some of the hadith where it says you start with the forehead, then you go back. So lots of views among scholars regarding the interpretation of what that means. And not only that, the issue of washing your leg or rubbing it, this wa arjulakum or arjilukum, where some scholars will say, okay, the idea of wamsahu bi ru'usikum wa arjulikum, that is referring to you can also rub your leg. Others will say, no, this is talking about mas'al al-khuffain. That is when you are wearing socks or you are wearing khuf. That is where the issue of rubbing masaha comes in,
as opposed to gasala.
And washing. So you will find scholars differing. Others will say, no, you can just rub it. And how do you even rob when even it is about Masa? How do you even rob? And that is why you see Ali ibn Abi Talib talking about لو كان الدين بالرأي لكان أدنى أولى بالمس من أعلاها. That had it been religion is all about, thinking, I think, or whims, that one would think that the bottom, which is already which is the one that is touching the ground, should be the right place for you to rob, not the top. So these are the things that usually are obtainable in this room. Look at the discussion or debate of scholars around the issue of creation, for example. The creationists and the evolutionists, as regarding this issue of God's creation. How do you accommodate this discussion? And there are lots of interesting, interpretations that are associated with the verses of creation. So basically, these are the kind of things you find in this room. No difference of opinion, no argument regarding what is available in the room, but what it meant, what are the implications of the things you can see in the room, usually is the domain of, discussion and engagement among scholars.
The last point you were touching on the issue of the creationist and those Muslims who accommodate the concept of evolution, where some view everything as having been created in an instant, that the word halaqa, to create. Others view that the Quran is silent regarding how other plants and animals were created. So some would say, yes, human being, Adam was the first human being, but other things, the Quran is silent. In other words, that halaqa is attributed to Allah, but halaqa also means creating one thing from another. And some would even say the Quran is not clearly against the idea that even Adam, human beings, were a product of evolution, but they look at evolution as a method of creation. But the key point I think you're touching here is that everybody is citing the Quran. Nobody is arguing on the Quran. The argument is the meaning and the implication of the words and what's the difference between halaqa and bada'a and bashar and nas and, the dilala. Sister Salah, could you give us more insight, more examples of what we find in room 2? If we call room 2 the room of qat'i thubut, but dhanni dilala.
Okay, there are those verses where some scholars have said that maybe a particular verse has been abrogated or a verse related to it has been abrogated. Now, because they come from this point where they are saying this verse has been abrogated, which is something that we'll discuss, because it's really when some scholars cannot reconcile two seemingly opposing or contradictory verses. Some would then conclude that this verse abrogates that one or that one abrogates this one. Now, when they interpret a verse, the message from that verse, based on this belief of abrogation having occurred, that interpretation that they give belongs to this particular room 2, because yes, they are still talking about a verse of the Quran, but because they are now interpreting it in a particular way, that interpretation based on their conclusion of abrogation is presumptive. Presumptive because there is nothing in either verse or the verses they're talking about that says this one abrogates that one. If there is such a thing, then they wouldn't even need to make an interpretation. It would be very clear. But they have to interpret. Their act of interpreting and doing ijtihad is what then brings in that presumptive element. Then we can look at some other verses.
So sorry, just on that one.
Yeah.
Therefore, what you're saying is, where one scholar says this has abrogated another,
Yes.
and has reached a conclusion,
Yes.
another scholar says, no, there's no abrogation.
Yes.
They all agree it's Quran, or hadith as the case may be. They all agree, say it's Quran. They all agree it's qat'i thubut. But what they are differing on is the dilala.
Yes, the implication.
Excellent.
So one scholar still feels this particular verse should be interpreted in this way. It has this weight in evidence. Another scholar is saying, oh no, but it's actually been abrogated by that one because. All right. Another thing is when we look at a verse in the Quran where Allah refers to the polytheist as najisun. The scholars, they differ on what does najisun, when applied to polytheist, what does this mean? And even when one says something is najas, that is impure or not, no longer whole or clean or pure, is it a literal interpretation we have to draw from that? In which case, if such a person comes close to you, don't allow them to touch you physically. Does it mean they cannot come close to a place you consider sacred, or is it really just talking about the state of their souls or their spirit with regards to faith or belief? So there is that's one example where there's difference of opinion regarding the meaning and therefore the implication. Another example is the verse of the Quran where Allah mentions, do not take the Christians and the Jews as awliya, protecting friends. One looks at that verse, the words seem clear enough. Don't take Christians and Jews as awliya. But we mentioned earlier this whole question of triangulation, and in a much earlier episode we said, even when on the face of it, source of evidence, a verse of the Quran or a hadith looks very clear, scholars usually don't stop there. They look at the whole, the context, the textual references. So in this case, some scholars look at that verse of the Quran. They look at other verses of the Quran where Allah also talks about the relationship with Christians and Jews, and they then say, this verse does not mean exactly what it seems to mean, which is all Christians and all Jews we are to cut off from them, we are not to interact with them, and they make certain interpretations. But we have also seen cases where scholars make certain conclusions based on this verse as it stands, and that again creates division of divergence of opinion and of thoughts. We see it among Muslims as well. A third example, a very common one, is when Allah talks about, refers to his hand, so the hand of Allah, or the throne of Allah, or says that, his arsh is above such and such, or when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam uses such terms as well. One says, yes, we all know what hand means, but in this context, do we actually know what is meant by Allah's hand? What is actually meant by Allah's throne? Is it a physical thing somewhere beyond our comprehension, or is it referring to Allah's majesty and power? And that is what you would see some scholars say, that it's really about his majesty and power. There is no throne somewhere, and on and on. And we even have references to the face of Allah. The word itself, we know what face means, but an interpretation has to be done, that this means Allah's pleasure, it means the sense of Allah's presence. Once you have that quality where scholars have to embark on ijtihad, they have to think, they have to use other sources, then the Dhanni element has come in, and such sources of evidence belonging to, once the source is authentic, and there's no argument about that.
This is important, I think, and the examples you've given are examples where there's a clear, undisputed source, like the Quran, or it may be Hadith Mutawatir, but the diversity of opinions comes from how it's interpreted. Is it taken literally? Is it taken allegorically? Is it taken metaphorically? And they differ, inconclusive, really, on that level. And I think this calls for greater intellectual humility on the side of Muslims, on the side of students of knowledge, that when you see things belonging to this room 2 category of evidence, the need to not undermine brotherhood, to need to understand there are many things in this room 2, many of which we have already accepted. And so the moment you realize there's another one, it's just once you've identified this is a room 2 issue, then the need to calm down, don't break brotherhood, because brotherhood and unity belongs to room 1. You don't throw away something that is in room 1 because of your particular preferred opinion in room 2. We do not, we don't doubt room 1, and so certainty should not be overruled by doubt. The certainty we have in room 1 should not be overruled by anything in room 2 or any of the other rooms.
I think to build on the metaphor of the room is to describe brothers that house belongs to them, and they start to squabble over something in room 2, and one says it's this, no, give me it's that, no. And they squabble and hit one another and rush all over the place so much that they crash into room 1, and break things down. So I think that's a way of extending the metaphor. Yes. So
Good.
whatever you do, just don't break anything in room one.
And probably the term khilaf, which usually refers to divergence of opinion among scholars, is something, as you've mentioned, we don't see that in room one. What we see is khilaf and divergence starts in room two. There's no ijtihad in room one, but ijtihad starts in room two and subsequent rooms where human reasoning now has to come in, and there's and so the need for civility, intellectual humility, and as we keep saying, to learn to agree to disagree agreeably. I'd like us to move now to room 3, the room of dhanni thubut, where there's presumption regarding the authenticity, but the meaning appears to be qat'i dilala. The meaning seems to be explicitly clear. What more, Sister Salah, can you tell us about room 2? What examples, what do we find in that room? What are the implications? Yes, please.
Okay. When we look at what would be in the next room, things that are dhanni thubut and qat'i dilala. Dhanni thubut is saying that this source of evidence, it's attributed to a source, but the link between this thing and the source is not definitively authentic. There's reason to say it probably is or it probably isn't. And anything coming from the Quran cannot be found in this particular room, let's say room 3. Everything in room 3 would come either from Hadith Ahad or the secondary sources. So if it's Hadith Mutawatir, it cannot be in this room, because this room, from the thubut, the authenticity, there is already probability, that probability factor. So if it would be Hadith Ahad, because any Ahad Hadith is so classified as Ahad because of the single chain, or the number of chains of narration being so low that it doesn't give 100% certainty. It does not give that yaqeen. It does not give one the sense that this is definitely from whoever it's said to have come from, without reasonable doubt. That's Ahad Hadith. Now, the other secondary sources, as we have mentioned again and again, by their very nature, they cannot give ilm al-yaqeen. If we talk of Ra'iyah Sahabi, saying the companion had this opinion and other companions did not contradict the opinion, it's not saying definitively that therefore, because the companion had the opinion, it therefore means, yes, indeed, the Prophet ﷺ said. So already you have that break. Another example would be Qiyas, for instance. Qiyas is simply saying there's an established ruling on a matter over there, and this is a matter here, and the way I see this matter and that matter are similar in this way and that way, therefore I should apply that ruling here. This is really the work, cognitive work of a scholar, learned, astute, still a human being, not the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and definitely not Allah. Now, why do these things belong to this room, room 3, and not the third room? Is because in as much as the source is not definitively authentic, but the meaning is clear. So crisp meaning. If you look at the words are not ambiguous. They are categorical. So you can have a categorical ruling drawn by a scholar using qiyas or Ra'iyah Sahabi, or you might have Hadith Ahad that is very, very clear. The meaning is clear, the implication is clear. When it comes to meaning and implication, you don't have divergence of opinion there. You don't have multiple possible meaning or interpretations that would then have to be explored by different scholars. When you have such evidence, standing alone by itself, the weight given to it is lower than the weight given to evidence coming from room 1, for instance. However, if this kind of evidence is taken on its own, and it is then corroborated or supported by other sources of evidence, it increases the strength and increases the weight. And in some cases, if the evidence corroborating it belongs to room 1, qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, this piece of evidence gains, it's leveled up, so to speak. When you find, a piece of evidence coming from this particular room, once again, we would say this cannot establish ma'lum min ad-din bidorura. This cannot be used to establish aqidah, creed. It cannot be used to establish who is a Muslim and who is not, because that one element is in it. Once the element is there, whether it's dhanni thubut, dhanni dilala, it has that impact of automatically saying, as Nuru would say, apply your brakes, slow down. We would say ease up, stop fighting, stand up, look around, just stop fighting. And we have several examples of this. One example is the one to do with dogs, where there's a hadith, or very different variants of a hadith, that mentions if a dog eats from a bowl or uses the bowl, before you use that bowl yourself, you have to wash it 7 times, and one of those times with sand. And the meaning is clear. 7 times is clear. Nobody is going to debate, is it 7 times 7, is it 7 minus 7? It's 7 times. Wash with water, that's clear as well. So when one looks at the hadith itself, the meaning is clear, but it's ahad hadith. And ahad hadith means there's a dhan element, a question around it. Did the Prophet ﷺ really say this the way this person said he did? We also have the other hadith, the issue of eating carnivorous animals. The meaning is clear, don't eat. It's clear. But again, what is the source? So it's qat'i dilala, clear in its meaning and implication, but dhanni thubut, the source, the authority is not certain.
Thank you so much. Malam Nasir, what would you add as for this?
Well, I think room 3, if you look at it carefully, one thing that is unique about it is it's not the issue of understanding what is inside. Everybody understands what is there, what it meant, but the question is whether it's supposed to be in the house, whether it matters to be there. That is where you find them disagreeing. For example, now you see while Mala Ahmad will say, okay, yes, it should be there and it should matter. Mala Malik will say, well, I don't think so, and if you insist that it should be there, okay, fine, but I need something that will really convince me that it should be there. But even with that, you cannot compare its significance and its relevance and value with something that is obtainable in room 1 that we all agreed of its value and importance in the house, or in room 2 that yes, we've all agreed that it should be there, only that we have some misunderstanding about its implication or what it should do. And Malam Nu'man will equally say, yes, I agree with you, Malik, that then it should be supported and it should have some restriction about its implication or what it can do. If we are going to leave it in this house, we know what it is. If we are going to leave it in this house, then there should be restriction. And part of the restrictions it shouldn't be in any way compared to what is in room 1 and 2. So these are some of the things. And Mala Ahmad, for him, the fact that it is in the house, it should compete with any other room in terms of significance and value and what have you. Malam Shafi will say, okay, it's in the house, right? I have problem with its presence, but since it's already there, then I don't think there is a need for any restriction regarding its privilege.
And it's good enough.
It's good enough, so there is no any restriction regarding its privilege to compete with anybody in the house. How it gets there, well, it's not the issue. It's already here and it's good enough. So this difference over whether it should be there or not, that is where the issue is. But about clarity of what it is and what it can do, usually you don't have them differing or disagreeing. Some of the examples you find in this particular room that have this attribute or these qualities, for example, the hadith that Rasulullah was reported to have said, whoever changes religion, whoever apostatizes, you should kill him. Man baddala dinahu faqtuluhu. It is a hadith that the meaning is clear. You understand what it means. There isn't any word in the hadith which could be interpreted differently. However, the hadith, because it is a hadith ahad, then that is where you see scholars debating over this and bringing in other evidence to deconstruct, while others will say, that is what it is. Like now the understanding of Mala Ahmad that it's already in the house, and why will you have problem? After all, you've understood the meaning. So this presumptive nature of, whether it should be there, the issue of legitimacy, of authority, of, authenticity, is the issue there. But understanding what the implication is in that particular room, there is no any difference of opinion. Or for example, the case of slaughtering 2 animals for a baby boy, when you have a newborn baby boy. The hadith around that is a solitary hadith, but the meaning is clear: 2 animals, that's what you are going to slaughter. Or the case of a rajam, for example, the hadith which speaks about this issue of stoning a married person who committed zina or adultery. This is also something that is clear: stoning, no any interpretation. But the hadith that is actually making that statement is a solitary hadith. Or for example, you look at the case, because generally if we say dhanni thubut, we are talking about hadith ahad and other secondary sources. They all fall within that category. If you look at the exception on zakat, the prohibition, there was a hadith that is established to prohibit zakat on horses, but then Umar came with an exception that this is what I understood and this is what it should be done. So the exception that was brought about by Umar is very clear, is explicit, but the fact that it falls within the category of what is considered to be the secondary sources, the dhanni sources, that is what actually makes it dhanni thubut wa qat'i dilala. So basically having said all this, what this entails is that in that particular room, the fact that we differ over whether this should matter, whether this should even be there in the first place, that legitimizes difference of opinion. Everybody accepts, okay, it's okay for you to differ, because it is about presence, whether it should be there or not. It's not about issues. So it's something that you agree to disagree at that particular level, and therefore to a large extent the need for us to be humble enough when it comes to this particular room and understand that it doesn't matter to most of the scholars, and therefore it shouldn't be stand in the way of issues that are related to this room 1, particularly room 1, where all of them agreed on. So the idea of looking at unity, the priority of unity, the issue of brotherhood, which is in room 1, taking given priority over what is in this particular room, where we are even debating or negotiating as to whether it should be there or not.
This is interesting, and I think as has already been implied, when we look at this room 3, where it is presumptive authenticity. Presumptive authenticity by definition means presumptive authority. So it's like a prescription that comes from, we believe it's from a doctor, but we're not 100% sure. It is presumptive because we believe it most likely is from a doctor, with the possibility that it could have been from another source. And what is written seems to be very clear, so there's no argument regarding what the prescription is. The argument is, are we really sure it's from the doctor? And as you've already mentioned, the moment it belongs to that category, we see bigger divergence of opinion among the scholars of fiqh. Whereas in category or room 1, Qati thubut, qati dilala, there's no disagreement. Everybody is certain about the authenticity, integrity of the source and the implication. In room 2, they agree on where it comes from, but they disagree on the implication, and you've given examples of this. In room 3, they disagree on whether the prescription is actually from the doctor. There's a disagreement there. Some feel the evidence is good enough. Others feel it's not good enough. They all agree it's not good enough for Aqidah. They all agree this kind of evidence of dhanni thubut is not strong enough to establish ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura. But the fact that there's a level of doubt about it makes the Malikis hesitate regarding giving this kind of evidence the power to establish fard or haram without support. If a ahad hadith comes on a topic and you've given examples of dog licking a bowl or eating carnivorous animals, the absence of support from Amal Ahl al-Madina for the Malikis makes them not consider evidence in this category as standalone, that such a hadith is powerful enough for that. It doesn't mean all Malikis would agree, but we see legitimate diversity. The Hanafis would not use that evidence as standalone to make these things clearly haram or make something fard. You would find them putting us under makruh tahrimi or wajib, a lower level of certainty. But the key point, I think, is the moment we move into things that belong to room 3, the need for humility. You've mentioned examples where, yes, the Prophet said, "Man baddala dinuhu faqtuluhu," whoever changes his religion to be killed. And as we will see, for some, that is explicitly clear. When, however, we look at, it's an ahad hadith, but I think even as we look further, we find some would even want to put this probably in room 4, where they would want to differ regarding the interpretation. Does it mean whoever changes, or whoever changes that's also a haribi? And we look at that debate. You mentioned the Maliki position, where even though there's a hadith that is very categorical, by Aisha, if I'm not mistaken, saying when a boy is born for the akika, for the naming ceremony, you slaughter 2 rams. But when it's a girl, you slaughter 1. Because the Malikis do not see that supported by the Amal Ahl al-Madina, when Ali's children were born, Hassan and Hussein, each one of them only had 1 ram slaughtered. Maliki do not take that hadith as instructional. They go with the amal. So even though it is explicitly clear what it is saying, because it belongs to that area, even if it's explicit, the authenticity of it's not absolutely true. Other scholars will now come with stronger evidence for their positions. And as we've already mentioned in the difference in the schools, this is where you find the order of secondary tools playing a role, where for some, if there's a conflict between ahad hadith and amal, they both belong to this category. You will find some saying, I am more certain, like the Maliki, with amal than with ahad hadith. The Shafis would say, I am more certain of ijma than ahad hadith. Or another scholar will come with, I am more certain with istishab than with this, or I don't accept maslaha, I am more comfortable with an ahad hadith, or another one, So we find that, very vibrant diversity between schools beginning to become more explicit once you get into room 3. And they differ regarding even the authority and integrity of the information compared to other sources. I'd like Malam Nasir, let's now move to room 4. The room where there's presumption regarding the authenticity. It's dhanni thubut or dhanni al-wurud. And there's presumption regarding the dilala, the meaning, the implication. what more could you tell us about this room?
Room 4 is a place where there are a lot of unknowns, or what we say, the presumption has permeated almost everything. There is presumption regarding the authenticity of what is actually there, meaning whether it should be there or not in the first place, and what it's the meaning, what does it even mean. There is presumption around all that, and that is a place where you find mostly ahad hadith and other secondary sources that are presumptive in meaning. That is what is obtainable in that particular room. It is a place where automatically you will have a lot of differences in opinion and understanding and position around them, and the legitimacy is quite visible when it comes to it is legitimate to differ. It is a place where I would say calm down, because it's an issue of does it even matter when at every level there is speculation. There are X and Y's in mathematics. They will say X and Y's. The unknowns are many. The desire for clarification, the misunderstanding, the curiosity to even know better is just there in the room. It is a place where the tools of istidlal, the safety net tools, are very, very important. Triangulation is very important in trying to verify things around this particular place. And by triangulation, I mean putting in play your usul, your qawaid, your maqasid in trying to validate or verify things that come out of this particular room. This is a place where you have many, many examples, and this is a place where we need to be cautious, and we need to always remember the significance of these priorities that we have, that we agreed upon in room 1, over these things that will actually be coming out from this particular place.
This point you have raised, that this is probably the largest room, but it's also the room with the least important issues. It's the one with the least level of, certainty. It's the extreme opposite of room 1 or category 1 of qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala. We're certain about the source and its meaning and implication. And as you've already implied, this is the room with the greatest amount of ijtihad. This is the room where, because of the lower level of certainty, there's the greatest amount of effort and exertion of the intellectual competencies of the scholar to maximize certainty, to at least, get a greater level of assurance regarding why they took this opinion compared to the other. But as you've mentioned, this is where we need also the greatest level of humility, of caution. Let's look at some examples. And I know this, as we've said, is a huge area. If you look at all the arguments in Sharia that are clear from the Quran and Hadith Mutawatir, that is category 1 and 2, room 1 and 2, there isn't a lot compared to where you are now looking at category or room 3 and 4, where you are now saying the ahad hadith, which are probably 90% or more of the hadith, or the fatwas that have come from qiyas and maslaha and urf and all the other dhanni sources. And then you look at the diversity of opinions. Could we get some examples that would help us understand more the kind of things in this room, so that I think for some who would be listening or watching, it'll help us see topics that in some corners there's heavy debate, but when you know where the topic lies, you kind of like, are we really breaking brotherhood or going to destroy the fabric of community and civility just because, it's a room 4 issue? Examples, please.
Like say, after all, it is room 4 issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's a room 4. We're in room 4, so let's calm down. Thank you for that. Yes, sister.
Several examples of things that belong in room 4, or have been put in room 4, if you like. things like when the stipulation that when two transacting parties want to renegotiate, they can do that as long as they have not separated from each other. And the only element there is both in the thubut aspect, the factor of what is this basis strong enough? Is it truly authentic? As well as the meaning. What is the meaning and implication when you talk about separating from each other? That's one example. Another example would have to do with the question of women in leadership. Can women lead? Can a woman be a head of state? Can a woman be a judge? The general principle, what we know, what is commonly known, is the answer is no, no, no. A woman can be a leader, can be a head of state, can't be a judge. When we drill down to the source of evidence, the textual evidence for these conclusions, you will find it's either based on Hadith Ahad or based on Qiyas. For example, the one of can a woman be a judge? That conclusion is based on Qiyas. Can a woman...
That's reasoning by analogy. Not that there's any Hadith or anything on it.
There's no Hadith, no verse of the Quran saying a woman cannot be a judge. A woman should not be a judge. Or it's prohibited for a woman to be a judge. There's nothing like that. When we look at the Hadith that has to do with women in leadership, when you drill down to the Hadith itself, what category is it? Hadith Mutawatir? Is it Hadith Ahad? It's Hadith Ahad. And as we've said again and again since the beginning of this program, that anything that's Ahad Hadith does not belong in the Qat'i Thubut category. Meaning, you cannot say that this, without a shadow of doubt, is something that the Prophet ﷺ said. And just for anyone who might think, oh, you're saying that because you're a woman. No, this is the principle. Among scholars, among mujtahid, they all know this, they understand this, and they would say this whether it's an issue to do with women or men or food or animals or the sky or trade. It's the principle. We are just saying when the principle is applied to this case, you come to the understanding that the question of whether a woman should be a leader or a head of state does not belong in room 1 because it's not Thubut. It does not belong in room 2 because it's, or again, it's not Thubut. Does not belong in room 3 because of the Dilala side of it, which is one. It belongs in room 4 because there's debate even at the level of the learned ones, the scholars, about even if you say leave alone the issue of the authenticity, what does this hadith mean? What does it imply? Yes, another example.
So on that, just to, so for some scholars, and I think anybody interested can see the discussion of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's commentary on this hadith, the differing interpretations. Some look at hadith in the context actually in which it was narrated with other hadith as part of the fulfillment of a prophecy, not a general statement making a law. So you do have that difference in the dilala, the implication, especially as some view it seems to conflict with actions of Aisha or other evidence. Just to elaborate.
Okay. Then when we look at the question of niqab, as we know, for some, wearing the niqab is considered to be of a higher level of iman, greater piety. But when we then say what's the evidence, even for saying niqab is part of the requirement or is mustahab, where does the evidence come from? We see that the evidence also belongs to room 4, meaning there is no categorical statement from the Quran or Hadith Mutawatir saying that a woman should cover her face.
I think there's no even Hadith Ahad.
Yes,
yeah.
I was saying that even when you say, okay, what about Hadith Ahad? In as much as we say Hadith Ahad has lesser weight or strength than Hadith Mutawatir, you don't even have that. So the question would be, so where does this come from? It comes more from a secondary tool, Swat al-Dariya, trying to block the means. And block the means to what? It would be said block the means to temptation, to fitna. That's why they would then say, it's better for women to cover their faces. So because you have this issue coming from room 4, you then see that there are many divergent opinions on this. There are those who would say, listen, it's not part of the dressing, it's not part of Islam, and would go so far as to discourage the covering of the face. There are those who would say, well, a woman can if she wants, can if she doesn't want to, but it's just mubah. It's not mustahab, that's encouraged. It's not fard, that's compulsory. So you have divergence of opinion based on this. Another example would be the issue of the circumcision of a male revert. When a man becomes a Muslim, or a male becomes a Muslim, and he's mature, aware now, does he have to be circumcised or not? We all understand that at birth, baby boys are circumcised, but what of when this person is already grown? Now, because when you look into Sirah, there were those people who became Muslims when they were grown and they were circumcised. Some say, it's good to do it, better to do it. Others say, but there were those who were not circumcised, so you don't have to. So you see divergence of opinion. So that question and rulings based on it, or conclusions drawn on that issue, belong rightfully in room 4. Don't need the vote, because there is no categorical evidence to support saying it should or it mustn't or whatever. Basically, a level of silence in the text. And don't need dilala, because so what meaning, what does this now imply, what should we do? You have that.
And probably just to add, so for the majority of scholars, for adults, it wasn't necessary. And what we find is there wasn't that rule as a practice during the time of Sahaba that whoever embraces Islam has to be circumcised. Unfortunately, it's just gotten so common. But as you've said, when you look at where it is coming from, it's a room 4 category.
One more room 4 category, I think, again, let me stir the pot a little bit, is the question of what is called female circumcision. And even right there, you have Doni Dilala coming in, because you say female circumcision. Some people say, what do you mean by female circumcision? Some say it is female genital mutilation. And I was in a room once when the discussion was going on. It was a setting of Muslims, and some of the participants said, stop saying female circumcision. You are perpetrating harm. Say female genital mutilation. Call it what it is. Others said, no. Now you are tainting a practice that is acceptable. There is FGM, female genital mutilation. There is female circumcision. So even before we even go into the textual evidence from the religious perspective, just at the level of English, there's already dhanni dilala, presumptiveness, and so on about what do you term this. But when you start to drill down and say, what is this based on? Where is the evidence for it? You will find that while people would cite hadith, the hadith being cited is hadith ahad, or what was said, you are saying, wait. What you're saying it means, is that what it means? So again, it belongs rightfully in room 4. And earlier on, we said when you understand which room or which category, which permutation group a matter belongs to, it helps you realize, why are we sweating this issue so much? Is it really about protection of the deen, or is it protection of the status quo or identity, or is it just fear of what the implication would be if we were to draw this or that conclusion? So it's interesting to find that a lot of the issues that generate emotional heat, that generates tension, that can turn an otherwise quiet conference hall into one buzzing with people talking and taking sides, are issues that seem to belong rightfully in room 4. Dhani thubut, dhani dilala. That if we were to use that same metaphor again of the room and say we all walk into the room and we are supposed to sit somewhere and spend 4 hours, or let's say we have a total of 5 hours to spend in this house and get some work done, it's interesting that we might happily, or not happily, we might tend to spend up to 4 hours in room 4 issues and just glance briefly in room 1 issues and say, yeah, let's go over there. So it just makes us start to ask ourselves again, is there emotional bias here? Is there cultural bias here? Is there just the fact of, this is what I've always known, this is the status quo, don't rock the boat, don't change anything? Wallahu a'lam.
It's interesting because Once something belongs to room 4 category, you're talking about hadith ahad, you're talking about, which is presumption, it can be used, at least in the view of many scholars, to establish farad, to establish haram. The Shafis would use it comfortably, some of the Malikis would, the Hanbalis would use it comfortably, so it's not nothing. However, it is something for which there would be or could be difference, especially if it is not corroborated by other evidence. What's interesting is when the whole debate, if you take what you just, the last example, like female circumcision, stands on hadith that are ahad, but that's not the problem. It is when scholars like Imam al-Shawkani or Ibn al-Munzir, who is a respected scholar of hadith also, considers those hadith as fabricated. It's when even the basis of it is being questioned. So the question is, then where is it coming from? So where some scholars consider it good enough for its purpose, other scholars look and say this is not authentic. You start to understand why some wouldn't even put it in room 4. Some would say this should be out of the room. But at the same time, I think this is the challenge with room 3 and 4, where you arrive at a conclusion with, say, qiyas, and the Zahiri say we don't recognize that type of qiyas. Like, that tool is not even recognized as a source of law. Another scholar doesn't consider urf as a source of law. Another one would say, fine, maybe there's no hadith, but we would still carry on with this practice because it is urf and there's nothing against it, or at least nothing known until, of course, medical experts actually are able to more empirically show the harm, both health-wise, psychologically, but also financially, is very hard on the family or the individual, etc. So it's just an interesting feature, I think, of room 3 and 4, or category 3 and 4 evidence, that what some would accept, some would not even accept those as even in any of those rooms. Alam Nasir, more examples, please.
Well, I think there are a lot of examples, as you rightly mentioned, around this particular room 4, where issues are not actually then thubut, then dilala. I think for me, it's about where do we spend most of our time at as Muslims? What should be our priority? She rightly mentioned that most of the Muslims, you would find them spending most of their time in room 4, and we all agreed that in terms of significance, in terms of value, in terms of importance to Muslims, room 4 is the least that we should spend our time at. We should be in room 1 or room 2. And again, if you look at the history of the religion itself, you would find the generations that were actually considered to be the best of generations, what they call Qurun al-Mufaddala, the generation of the Sahaba, companions, and the Tabi'in and the Tabi'in. You would find most of what they did was spending their time in this room 1 and maybe 2. You hardly can hear them, spending their time in room 3 and 4 to a large extent. And we know lots of traditions that actually encourage us to emulate Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions. And I incidentally find it interesting if you begin to look at similarities between this idea of room 1, 2, 3 and the time management quadrant itself. The only variation probably is where in time management the priority is you should be in quadrant 2, while here
of what is important,
exactly.
but
if you look at if you look at the parameter of importance, you will then understand that there is no any difference between quadrant 1 and 2. But the issue of urgency, probably that is what differentiates. And I think the most important thing, since in terms of the rooms that we're able to come up with, the priority, the key variable is importance and significance. That I think is the reason why 1 becomes the most important room. And of course, not forgetting also the importance of room 2, which is actually where the priority of importance, even in time management, is always, because in room 1, because of the urgency, something you still must do, but it speaks to the idea of quality of how you do it, and the issue of nature of a human being, of slowing things and what have you. So I think this idea of attaching importance to this room 1 and ensuring that nobody plays with room 1, that it is the area where the most important thing is. And that is where you have, I keep talking about this idea of minimum effective dose. This your 20% that you need, which will give you the 80% of outcome and benefit and output, is in room 1. So the need for us to really be in room 1 all the time, and to always remember, as you mentioned, that when an issue is brought up, when you see Muslims really engaging one another and tension is rising, it's important for us to remember and ask ourselves, which room do this issue belong to in the first place? I think remembering that it is not in room 1, it is not in room 2, will help significantly in dousing the tension, in resolving most of the problems. Allahu Akbar.
Jazakallahu khairan. I think there are so many examples that could go into room 4 in particular, but also room 3 and room 2. But as you've already clearly mentioned, the most important for us to hold on to and recognize what keeps us together with all our diversity, our unity, is coming from room 1. The whole field of usulul fiqh exists really because of room 3 and 4 in particular. The whole role of qawaid al-fiqhiyya, maqasid sharia, ijtihad only starts after room 1. And so we can see the efforts that scholars have put in to try and maximize certainty, but at the same time, the humility to not just recognize there are other schools of thought, other methodologies of analysis of things that belong to the dhanni category, but that the respect they give is such that they do not, when it comes to da'wah and inviting people to Islam, they do not recognize converting people from one school to another school as da'wah. They don't consider changing one madhab to another madhab as an objective. They actually take it that you do not negate one ijtihad with another ijtihad. That when it comes to juristic reasoning, they take it that this is a relative truth. Allah knows best. And as Imam Shafi would say, Abu Hanifa has been quoted to say something similar, that I believe I am right with the possibility that I am wrong. And I believe your position is wrong with the possibility that you are right. Some would say it that I believe I am right and you are wrong, with the possibility that you are right and I am wrong. So there's that real intellectual humility. I like the dua of Imam Shafi when he said, may Allah show me the truth on the tongue of the person I am arguing against. We would rather let Allah show the other person the truth from me. Because if you want that dua to be answered, you have to listen to what the other person is saying. You have to be a learner. You have to have that humility of the real possibility that you could be wrong. The discussions we've had, and there are so many others that we don't have time for, and we will hopefully, and we've touched on some, and people can look into all of these. I know sometimes just raising these issues angers some people. Why are you saying this? Why are you bringing doubt on this? And it's because it is an area of doubt. You would find books like Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid bringing positions of scholars like Imam at-Tabari Imam Abu Thawr. These are mujtahid imams who consider it permissible for women to lead men in prayers if they are more competent. Now, you're not saying this to stir anything. You're saying it to understand that this is not a topic of takfir. This is an area where distinguished jurists have differed. Why? Because the moment you say, bring your evidence, you find it belongs to category 4, as many other things belong to category 4. And extremism is to treat room 4 material as if it is room 1. To treat something on which scholars differ as if it is illegitimate to have differences of opinion, and you are even a kafir. And we've had Muslims killed by other Muslims on category 4 and category 3 and category 2. Topics where you would say our unity in category 1 of room 1 material, that brotherhood should be enough to keep our hearts together, such that our minds may differ when we move into other rooms, but our hearts are still one. We still recognize each other, not just as human beings, but people belonging to the same faith. You wanted to...
Yeah, just as you were talking about extremism is when people treat things in room 4, as though they were things in room 1, I think by implication, when we do that, we are actually then relegating room 1 to a lower position. So it's almost like, for you to move those things into room 1, it means you have to take something out of room 1 to create space for that. And the thing being taken out might be this unity, the brotherhood, or the supremacy of Allah's words and the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or ideas such as justice and compassion. Because until one disconnects from some of those ideas, sometimes without realizing it, it would be impossible to treat things in that category knowingly as though they were words of Allah.
And just to wrap up on this, and as a way of reminder that
I really like an example of the trade-off that happens between this attempt to take something from room 4 and bring it to room 1. This is an issue where you know yourself that there are lots of opinions, there are lots of arguments about the meaning of this particular issue, about whether it should even be there, whether even it should matter. And now you are now exchanging it with something that there is unanimity about its status, about its value, about its significance. This weighing benefit, if you come back to this idea of weighing benefit and harm, and now you agree inside yourself, you agree that you can trade this up with this one. I think this is a serious problem, and it's what actually creates a serious problem for the ummah. It's a greatest danger actually for you to even make an attempt to do that. And as we all know in life, ordinarily life is about trade-offs. What are you giving? For example, you give your time, you give value to be paid. Is the value of what you are being paid equivalent to the value of the time you are able to give? Is the value of what you are now taking for having had what it is? How things are really? It's just like saying taking trash to the mosque sometimes, taking something that is probably filthy or problematic to the mosque. How does it appear to you? How does it even seem to you? That's why I really like this idea of trade-offs and the implication of what one is trying to do by trying to switch room 4 things in room 4 to room 1.
Thank you so much. And I think just to reiterate, nobody is saying that judgments cannot be made with the evidence in each room. Yes. Whether it's Ahad Hadith, Qiyas, Quran, Ra'i Sahaba, you will always find scholars and madhabs who will make certain things haram even though it is in room 4. Yeah, they will use an ahad hadith and they are sure it is haram. And they are fine with that. So this is not this is that you can't. It's just to know that because it is this type of evidence, it is qiyas, it is ijma of a particular group or time on an issue to do with, maslaha or urf or, some changing factor, that you will have diversity of opinions. When a fatwa is established by urf, it can make haram, it can make mustahab, it can make this, but you should also accommodate the fact that people with a different urf would have a different fatwa for that. For you, this type of material is dressing like a woman. Why? Because of your own urf. And it's okay to say that is haram in your context. So I think it's important. This is in no way belittling the fatwas of any scholar, but just to recognize that that's a fatwa that belongs to Category 4, where there is diversity and there's legitimacy for that, because there is inherent levels of uncertainty regarding the evidence, the thubut, and the dilala. So this diversity, I think, should not make us say it's not important. Actually, these are the rooms probably where intellectual humility is even more important. It is where there are going to be differences that we need to actually protect the brotherhood even further. Why? Because we already agree on room 1. There's no debate on room 1. But let's not belittle the value of room 1 by breaking brotherhood using some area that it's just ijtihad of scholars and dhanni, that all the scholars agree. This is all dhanni. And we allow that to create disunity, conflict. It underscores the importance of triangulation, of usul, of qawaid, of maqasid, of cross-examination of positions using all tools available. And even if you can't be humble, pretend to be humble. Hopefully Allah will help make you more humble. Practice humility, and hopefully, inshallah, as you practice sabr, Allah makes you a sabir.
You're not pretending you're practicing.
You're not pretending you're practicing. Yeah, you have to start somewhere. May Allah increase us all in knowledge. This brings us to the end of the series. The next one we will be looking into would be the subject of the maqasid Sharia, the higher intents and objectives of Sharia. Until we meet there, inshallah, thank you so much for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.